You're listening to... Whoa, what was that? Is that a train?
A train going by.
That's fantastic.
You're listening to Lab Out Loud, Science for the Classroom and Beyond. And I'm your co-host, Dale Basler.
And I'm Brian Bartel.
And we are going to go back in time for all of us and look back at one particular year in 1986. And our guest is a Wisconsin science teacher joining us today. His name is Larry Scheckel. Welcome, Larry.
Good morning. Thank you, Dale and Brian. Glad to be on.
Is that still that train going by?
That's still going by, but
hey, it's delivering...
Train in the backyard and a lake in the front yard.
Oh, yeah, that's perfect. Larry is joining us, connected from, you are in Tomah, Wisconsin. And listeners, get out your Wisconsin Midwest map, and you can find that on your Google Maps and know where you are.
That's Tomah.
Yes.
There's a lot of cranberry bogs near Tomah, too. Just a little point of trivia.
Isn't cranberries, like Wisconsin's like the first or second cranberry producer, right?
I believe it is. And
Number one. Even though I think Vermont gets a lot of fanfare.
Massachusetts is number 2.
Yeah, so that area, but little do they know that we're sneaking in with all the cranberries.
Yeah, so if you had some ocean spray recently, you might be getting hints of Tomah in your bouquet.
That means our state quarter should have had some cranberries on it. Maybe they're in there in the background instead of just that cow and stuff.
Well, Larry, thank you for joining us. Can you tell us who you are and what do you do, or what did you do, or both?
Well, I grew up on a farm down in Crawford County near Prairie du Chien and went to a one-room country school for 8 years. Went to Seneca High School. Graduated in 1960. I went into the Army for a couple of years, and then I went to electrical school, and then I worked as an engineer for Channel 8 television in La Crosse. And,
oh, wow. I didn't know that.
There's a lot of things I didn't know about you, Larry.
During that time, I started going part-time to college, started at age 23, graduated at age 29 in 1970. And then a position opened up as a math teacher in Tomah, so I was hired. And then physics was my major, math was my minor. And after a couple of years, I was teaching all physics classes. So after that, we were married in 1965 and had 3 boys. And my wife and I retired from teaching in 2010. Mm-hmm. I taught 38 and a half years. She taught 35. And we're enjoying life and grandchildren, travel a lot, do a lot of writing.
Oh, nice.
That's right. You're an author, too.
Well, we have 9 books. 6 of them are science books, and then 3 are, one is about growing up in a farm country, another about country schools, and then another is about a murder that occurred near our home in 1926 down in Crawford County.
So this is it's not fiction. It's a real story.
It's a real story. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
Yeah. It's a fascinating account of a Norwegian Lutheran boy murdered a Norwegian Lutheran girl, and that does not happen, and certainly doesn't happen in 1926, but it did.
Yeah.
And at that time, it was called Crime of the Century. Of course, we have a few of those since then.
Yeah. Yeah.
So listeners, Dale and I have known Larry for many years because he was a science teacher in Wisconsin, and Dale and I are both science teachers in Wisconsin. So we've crossed paths many times at conferences with our state science teacher organization, and he's just a general all-around guy. But I am learning things about Larry in these last 3 minutes that I didn't know at all. And in fact, that's actually setting us up for the show, because we had come across a podcast that talked about having teachers in space from the Teacher in Space program back in the 80s. And we would listen to this podcast. We'll have some information in the show notes. And that basically detailed that there were 2 science teachers from every state. And so naturally, I was walking the dog at this time, and I'm like, who is this? Who was it? Because we probably knew at least one of them. And sure enough, I didn't know the other person, and maybe you could speak to that. But Larry was one of these people that was selected as the representative as one of the 2 representatives from Wisconsin to going through the selection process. So, Larry, tell us about this. I mean, this is a fascinating thing, and again, we didn't know anything about this.
114 teachers selected, because 2 per state: Department of Defense, Guam, Puerto Rico, Bureau of Indian Affairs.
Mm-hmm.
So you were one of the 2 from our state, so naturally reaching out.
Yeah. Well, it was the Teacher in Space program originated with President Reagan in 1984. He was running against Walter Mondale for president, and he wanted to kind of encourage teachers maybe to vote for him. I'm not sure about that, but
that kind of stuff happened back then too.
He said the first civilian in space should be a teacher. So they put out a call. It was 11,000 filled out the essay. There was a 12-question essay, 18 pages. And of those 11,000, 304 were from Wisconsin. And
wow.
Okay.
So they had a contest. If there were 5 that were selected from Wisconsin and were called down to Madison at the DPI and had interviews. You had to have a physical. It wasn't that stringent. It was the same as a private pilot would get. And then from those 5, the videotape recording and questions and answers, they selected 2. And that was myself and Ellen Bierman from West Dallas, Brookfield area. And so we were the 2 that went to Washington, D.C. in the summer of 1985. It was a week-long venture. We had a lot of presentations from NASA. We had tours. We spoke. President Reagan spoke to us in the White House. We had a lot of receptions. Met the congressman from our area, and then at the end of that week, they said, "Well, you all go home now, and if you get a call, you'll be one of 10 that will be going down to Cape Kennedy for 2 weeks of training." And I didn't get that call.
How much were you stinging by your phone at that time? Like, nope, can't go out for groceries. Nope.
I didn't think I would be selected. Quite frankly, that was a pretty powerful group. There was a guy who had sailed his boat around the world. One had written 10 books. There were marathon runners, very, very accomplished teachers. One from Kansas was Top Gun pilot.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah, Steve Warren. And so I didn't get that call, and Christa McAuliffe was selected of those 10. Barbara Morgan was the backup. And then, of course, they underwent months of training, and then the shuttle was sent up in January of 1986.
Were you a type of, like, when I think of someone going to space, I think maybe like you have to have a little bit of a thrill seeker brain. Were you do you do any of the activities similar to that, where there's a decent amount of risk involved?
Well, not really. I've been a private pilot, but there was a number of private pilots in there. But I thought space travel was safe. They've never had an accident in the space shuttle. I don't think anybody dreamed that we'd have that explosion that occurred. They certainly wouldn't have sent up a teacher if they knew that was a doomed flight. Yeah. So it was a very surprising, gut-wrenching thing that happened.
All right.
I remember it as a 6th grader. That's what, and I was in Chilton Catholic School, and this was such a big deal for kids too. So they had I remember us all being in a room that we weren't usually in to watch, and we didn't, you didn't really watch a lot of live TV or anything like that. It wasn't as accessible back then. And I remember being in there, and I just remember kind of rolling in and then rolling out, and then
the one TV rolling in, or you rolling in?
Just sort of like we're all doing this, and then all of a sudden now we're not doing this.
Yeah.
And then I also don't remember thinking about it that much when I was younger. Like we talked about, like maybe there was a political, stance to it, or there were definitely political conversations about it and all that kind of stuff. And I don't know any of that because I was a kid and not paying attention to that part. It wasn't until later in life that I started paying attention to, more of the space shuttle missions and NASA in general and those kinds of things. So it was always kind of looking back. So it's kind of interesting just to hear what were your friends saying, your coworkers saying when you were selected?
Well, locally, it kind of was a big deal for the local papers. They put my picture in there, had interviews. The local television from La Crosse did some interviews. It was a big deal. For my mother, it was a big deal because she was born in 1913 and space travel was pretty awesome for her.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, you came from a one-room schoolhouse, and
yeah, all 113 of us were down there for the launch. We were there for a week, and we had tours, and we met a lot of the astronauts. And
so you were there in person when the accident happened.
Yeah, that's right. All of us were, and it was supposed to go up on Tuesday, and there was delays. So the convention that we were at, if you will, was from January 20th to the 24th, and the launch was supposed to be on the 22nd, which was a Tuesday. Well, it got delayed. Partly there was a dust storm over Senegal. There was bad weather. There was the hatch that wouldn't close, so they kept delaying it. And about half of us went home on Sunday. If we had known that it was going to go up the next day, we probably would have extended. Well, it happened to go up on Tuesday. I had basketball refereeing commitments. I'd been gone from the classroom for a week. So I decided to be one of those that was going to go back to Tomah. And that morning that it happened, we were there was sort of a break in the day, and we were registering students for the next class year, year. And a kid came in. I was talking to some students. A kid came in and says, the shuttle blew up. And I didn't think much of it. And then pretty soon another student came in the classroom and said, the shuttle blew up. And then everybody turned the television on, and then we saw what happened there. So that's kind of how I got to know about it.
We'll be right back. And teaching through that is not necessarily easy, and then especially in your position, were you then just bombarded with emotions, questions, those kinds of things?
Well, yeah, it was kind of weird because the principal started getting calls from newspapers, television, and so forth. And he finally just came up to my room because I was teaching physics and says, Larry, why don't you go down to my office and I'll take over the classroom and you answer these calls. So I spent maybe an hour and a half just receiving calls from various media people.
Wow.
And then they actually had a lady newscaster from Minneapolis. They flew down by helicopter to do an interview. And really? How do you feel kind of thing, where they stick a microphone in your nose and say, well, your mother just died. How do you feel? One of those things, which I thought was kind of weird, but we got through it. And I was over to the EAA a few years ago, maybe quite a few years ago, and Chuck Yeager was there, and also Neil Armstrong. Neil Armstrong was the speaker that night in the woods, and he was asked, because he was on the commission to study the Challenger explosion. He says, "How do you feel about that?" He says, "Well, we lose people every day. We lose people on the highway. We lose people in accidents." He says, "We're going to fix what's wrong and go on." And I thought, well, that was a pretty good response there, because the teacher had two children, Scott, age third grade,
young children,
yes, and a daughter that was in first grade, And of those 7 astronauts, there was 11 children that were under the age of 10.
Wow.
So, you're losing a lot of good people that have families. And so that's always sad when that happens.
Did that change science education one way or another from your perspective?
I don't think so. Not really. The teaching of science has always been pretty much the same thing year after year, that you incorporate new things that come in the area of biology and in physics and so forth, chemistry. So I don't think it's changed a lot there.
Can you conjecture, like, if the explosion hadn't happened, do you think that would have had the intended impact on boosting science?
That's a good question. I think you're right, because she was supposed to teach, Christa McAuliffe was supposed to teach 2 half-hour lessons from space, and they were going to be broadcast live to classrooms around the country. And they're, of course, going to be videotaped in case a classroom couldn't use that particular time. The first the first broadcast was going to be on a Wednesday, and that was going to be basically a tour of the space shuttle. She was going to introduce all the astronauts, talk about the equipment, the navigation, the satellites that they're putting out, and so forth. And the second lesson, 2 days later, she had prepared about 6 or 7 different experiments. And she was going to go through those experiments and show how things behave in space differently than they happen here on Earth. And that was kind of neat, because in the conferences that we had with all the teachers, we kind of helped design those experiments. And so I kind of felt a little bit of kinship with that.
Yeah.
Did you get to know her at all?
Well, yes and no. Because we were in Washington for a week, I didn't get to know all of them in 113 within 1 week.
Yeah.
But I remember she was fairly quiet. I remember standing at Washington Airport. At that time it was called National, now it's called Reagan. And she was ready to get onto a flight, and I was to a different flight. And she says, what do you think our chances are? I says, well, about a 1 in 114.
You could take the teacher out of the math class, but you can't take the math class out of the teacher, right?
She was the one selected. And it was a good choice, I think. She was middle 30s, early 30s there when that happened. And she was a quick learner. She was a good speaker, public relations, very open and friendly.
Now, if memory serves, I believe that NASA actually completed those lessons like later on, and I think we can find them online if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, they
and
did.
I think part of the application was you proposing an experiment to do in space. Do you remember what you proposed?
Yes, well, a little bit.
I know it was almost 30 years ago. That was last century.
Yeah, one of those was how a magnet would behave in space, how it would show the magnetic field, and you show the magnetic field by using iron filings, And another one was how liquids would behave in space. In other words, if you pour, say, an oil-based or kerosene or whatever onto water, they separate out. They're not immiscible. So what would happen in space? And then another one that I had was how does a flame behave? So if you strike a match here on Earth, you know that the flame sort of goes up. But in space, where you have the idea of weightlessness, how would that behave? So those are 3 that I remember. And I think probably proposed 4 or 5 total.
Okay. I think there's a liquid in space one that was actually accomplished. I could see them saying, "We're not gonna put iron filings in the space station because they're gonna be there forever."
I had a poster outside my a microgravity poster from that I got, a wall chart. That's what they call them, educational wall charts. That I got from NASA about the microgravity tests, and had photos of the flame too, of how what it looks like on here on Earth. And
Yeah.
I think in the space station. It's bulbous. It's kind of like a little.
Yeah. The one with the iron filings, by the way, it was basically like a transparent beach ball,
Okay.
and the magnet was suspended in the middle, and the iron filings then were in that enclosed ball. So the iron filings couldn't go anywhere.
I was thinking 2-liter bottle or something.
Oh, that would work too. Yeah.
Yeah.
That would be harder to get up there, though.
True. But you can collapse the beach ball. That's
a fascinating thing. Back then, you would have been, if you had made it to the 10, you would have been trained to basically complete basic space shuttle kind of operations, wouldn't you have?
A little bit. Yeah, they went those 10 down there for 2 weeks. I kind of keep in contact with some of those. They basically they went in so-called vomit comet, where you experience weightlessness for 20 seconds or so. They did the underwater kind of thing with the training about how to eat in space, go to the bathroom in space, that sort of thing.
The payload specialists is what I think they called them.
Yeah. So they had that kind of training. But the two that were selected, Christa McAuliffe and Barbara Morgan, they had extensive training from the end of summer all the way through January when they launched. So they had a lot of more training than just those 10 did. But out in Washington, we got to meet some of the crew, like Dick Scobie and Mike Smith, Judy Resnick, she's a neat lady, Ron McNair. So it was interesting because Onizuka was a Japanese American. He had a PhD in physics, and Greg Jarvis, he was a payload specialist from Hughes Aircraft. He had got bumped on an earlier NASA flight because they took up a congressman. And then Mike Smith was a test pilot, a Navy veteran. Scobie was a Vietnam veteran pilot. So they were it was kind of neat to meet those people. We were in Washington. We got to meet John Glenn and Eugene Cernan, who was on the last Apollo flight. And
that's fascinating. Can we go back to the time where this was announced? And then you said there was over 300 people from Wisconsin that applied, and obviously probably similar throughout the rest of the United States. So this was a big deal, right? This was a chance, and well, again, one in 11,000 back then. But did you have a lot of colleagues that applied for this as well? That you were all kind of competing against each other, but like filling out an 18-page essay back then, you did this on typewriters, right?
No, I did a computer.
Oh, good.
Right.
Still the 80s, Brian.
Oh,
that's true.
Yeah,
a Macintosh probably, right?
But it had to be put on a written sheets, so you couldn't send it in digitally like you could today. But the requirements were not that stringent. You had to be a U.S. citizen, teaching 5 years, and then you had to be from Wisconsin, of course. So you had to develop that project. You had to have 3 letters of recommendation. But I don't know anybody else from Tomah that filled it out. I'm sure a number of WSST people filled it out, but I don't recall who they might have been.
That's all we know, Larry. WSST, for our listeners, is Wisconsin Society of Science Teachers, and I believe that's probably the first time. That's where I met you, Larry. Probably at a session that you presented at.
Yeah, those are good times. We got a lot of fun with those.
So let's talk about science in the 80s, and one of the pieces that kind of like sparked this Teacher in Space program was dropping test scores in math and in other things as well. And Reagan had noted that dropout rate, school violence, these were things that were challenges to education at the time. And the Teacher in Space program was in part to respond to that, and it could have been, yes, like you mentioned, an election, like piece there as well. But can you speak to what was happening with education and science education back then?
Yeah, a little bit. They had that sort of a landmark study that came out. It's called Nation at Risk. and it talked about those dropping test scores in science and math, and also in economics and history. And I think one of the things that happened in science education that was detrimental was the loss of those Eisenhower funds.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of teachers went to summer classes, got their master's degrees, met other colleagues, got involved with sharing. And when those funds dried up, the science education became crippled a little bit, in my opinion. They did try something in Wisconsin, those Cray Academies, you recall, held around the state. And I was involved with those. I think you were too.
We actually had Christa McAuliffe Academy in our area. So same kind of idea.
Yeah, that was over at, was that Appleton?
That was in Appleton.
Yep. The Eisenhower funds were federal funds, right?
Right.
And what started those?
Well, they in my opinion, from what I remember, they came from the Department of Education, and even before that, to try to boost science education. And they were just for science and math. Later, those Eisenhower funds were also put for teachers who wanted to social studies, English. In other words, they were available for other teachers other than science and math teachers. Right. And then they sort of went away altogether. The National Science Foundation funded a lot of that, those things in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s there.
Wasn't that funding in place, though? Like Eisenhower funds, for example, to send teachers to training and stuff. Wasn't that available in the 80s?
Oh, I think maybe in the 80s. By the 90s, I think they dried up by that time, didn't they?
I think I got the tail end. I think.
Yeah. Early 2000s even, I think they had some available, and I don't know what it was like earlier, but I think
some of the other teachers talked about how, like, I remember I started in 98, and some of the more veteran teachers were like, you didn't know, like, this is nothing compared to what we used to have. I do remember that.
Yeah.
And I was able to tap into some funding to help send me to a national conference back in the very, very early 2000s, and that was one of my first, I guess, connections to the NSTA, back then, National Science Teachers Association. And that was, again, I think a pivotal moment in my career as a science teacher.
For sure. I agree, because as you know, we all went to WSST state conventions every year. And then I went to and also presented at many of the NSTA, the National Science Teachers Association. And I learned so much by going to those conventions and attending sessions and then talking to other teachers. I got so many ideas and so many demonstrations and the way other teachers do things. That was, to me, was the most valuable part of those two, the state and the national organizations. That collaboration.
Yep, and there was funding for other things back when we were first teachers. There were summer opportunities, like you mentioned. Actually, now that I do remember it, you were my teacher for the Christa McAuliffe Academy for a robotics class. We did a robotics class back then at Appleton North High School, and it was my way of exploring something that was an emerging field back then.
Yes, okay. Yeah, right.
I have to show you. I got to go to. I'm going to put this in the chat. Because I'm proud of it.
Listeners, you won't be able to pull this up, but yes.
I'll put the picture in the show notes. You can see me a long time ago. Do you see that photo?
Yes. Yeah.
It's a very, very young picture of Dale.
Isn't it? Look how baby face I look. That is, I got to go for this teacher workshop, all teachers. And we got to go down to the Kennedy Space Station, toured everything. There's a little bit of connection to NASA tragedy, too. This is me standing in front, and I had to go back and look, because if you look at my face on there, I'm like, like stunned, because this backstory is we were a teacher group in 2004 touring the Kennedy Space Station. And we got to, do some behind the scenes things. We did little workshops, those kinds of things, and then develop lessons and stuff like that. We got to, kind of bus tour, got close to some of the launch pads, and I'll talk about why we got so close to the launch pads. And then Andrew Chaikin, I think, was the author that rode with us. He wrote for he wrote some Apollo books that were used for Apollo 13, the movie, and things like that. So we got to do all of this. And one of the things we were going to do is we were going to look at shuttle main engine, the room. And that's the room where they kind of like rebuild the engines and work on the engines. And that is in the orbiter processing facility. So orbiter processing facility is this building in which the space shuttle's the shuttle part that we know is the orbiter, and so that just rolls in there like a plane would do, and then rolls out, and then they go and stack it in the big vehicle assembly building, the one with the big flag on and stuff, the giant building. And so we were there, and again, it was January 22nd, 2004. So this is after the Columbia disaster. So Columbia didn't make it in reentry, and so that happened, and we were down at NASA at that time. So things were kind of just quiet and a little surreal,
a little tense,
a little sort of memorial signs all over the place. So because the launch pads were all kind of shut down, we got to go closer to them. We got to go into these places because everything was kind of quiet. And so we were like looking at this orbiter processing facility, and these people are walking with us, and this one guy comes by, and then we're like, you mean Discovery? The space shuttle Discovery is like just in that building? He's like, oh yeah, it's down that corridor behind those doors. I'm like, oh, too bad we couldn't see it. And they're like, you can't see it. And then all of a sudden it was like, rah, 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 and then they mumble. And then all of a sudden they're like, all right, you guys come with me. Mumble. So come with me. And then we go down this corridor, and doors open, and it's huge. You can't actually see the whole thing because it's all being worked on. It's kind of like turning it over. It's like, that kind of reminds me of like if you go camping, you got to turn your camper over at the end, clean it all up again. And so we...
they don't just hose it down, though, you're saying.
Yeah, we walked on there to do all this tile work, and the tiles on the space shuttle were a very, very big deal because of the Columbia disaster was related to a tile problem. So we all got to walk underneath it and sworn not to touch anything. I could have, as you can see, touch Discovery, but we didn't. I think I touched the railing. Discovery adjacent. And so I got to stand under that and have that picture, and I was showing that to my kids, and because I told them that, and they're like, no. And then I had to like find the same picture where the landing gear is and kind of show it. But that was the closest I got, and it was weird because that shuttle went up. That was the next one to go. It was being prepped for the return to flight mission, and yeah, it was a strange time to be at NASA during that, but that is the closest. And I've always been fascinated I've always been kind of fascinated with NASA as I got older in high school and things like that. And this was like, as you got just giddy from those kinds of things, which makes me want to, I was talked about earlier before we started recording that I wanted to talk about the space shuttle sort of as a symbol. And what struck me in
Soyuz
August
doesn't do it for you, Dale?
Yeah. In August, I went to as a good science teacher, you go to the National Observatory. My wife and I had a 25th outing anniversary. We went to Europe. We went to London. And I'm like, we're going to the meridian, the prime meridian. So we go there, and in their gift shop, they have all kinds of astronomy things, but then they have a little bin of little toy space shuttles. And I'm like, this isn't the U.S. This craft doesn't fly anymore, but it still is like, if you're going to sell a little toy spaceship, that's the symbol that, it'll be. It's sort of like the scientist in a white lab coat kind of thing. It becomes the symbol for that.
Yeah. Even
in movies, it gets kind of, like we need a spacecraft. They make something that looks like the space shuttle. It's become Shuttle-ish. Yeah. So familiar because of that. And I don't know. I just wanted to know if anybody had any thoughts on that idea.
Yeah. Well, it's still a pervasive kind of icon. I mean, Lego just released a space shuttle set in the last year, and that was a big deal. They also replicated like the Hubble Space Telescope. So yeah, it's still out there. And it was like, yeah, we got to get this. Jack and I both got one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can relate to that being close to the shuttle because in the years following the Challenger disaster, we were all named so-called space ambassadors. So we would meet for 5 or 6 days at some place. And one of the places was JPL out in California when they did the flyby of Neptune. And one of the side trips we took was to Palmdale, where they were building the Endeavour, which was the shuttle that replaced the Challenger. And
the new model.
Yeah, that's right. So we were able to and they were putting the tile on.
Yep.
There was one guy putting the tile on and one guy inspecting it.
It seems like the shuttle's just all tiles.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's funny. I think if you have a modern icon, I think the thing that would come closest would be one of the Mars rovers.
Oh, for sure. I'm
waiting for that Lego set.
Two in iShot right now. I have one I 3D printed, and then I have the Sojourner. I have the Hot Wheels still in the package. It's collecting dust. Hot Wheels Mattel Sojourner Mars rover. It's got the lander, the rover, everything. It's like, those kinds of things. But I think that's my science teacher in me, though.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, but it fascinates students. I mean, you and I watched when one of the most recent rovers landed, and it was just, it's captivating, and it's just like we both wore NASA T-shirts for it on that day, and that's just one of those. We both had NASA T-shirts on. We have a Christmas NASA T-shirt on, and
mine has a space shuttle. It's like a snowman riding a space shuttle. Do you think that the Artemis mission, for example, that's kind of like the moon mission? I mean, that's like a rocket, a capsule. Is that going to have that same grab for people?
Yeah, it's a 4-man thing. Yeah, they're talking about going back to the moon.
Yeah,
and they probably will in perhaps 3 or 4 years, maybe sooner. Mm-hmm. But there's other things too that are really captivating. The James Webb Space Telescope.
Yeah,
right? Just a fantastic program and sending back great pictures of the universe back in time to almost the beginnings of the Big Bang. So a lot of things are happening outside of the moon and Mars.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think there can be that same kind of pull for students and for teachers as well. Like, these are examples of what science education can reap when done correctly, and when and I think that science exploration is another place where we can talk about international collaboration at its finest, and you don't see that in a lot of other things.
That's true. Mm-hmm. Yeah. The International Space Station is an example of very good cooperation among many nations, and still going strong. It will probably go for another 5 or 10 years, and then some of the exciting things that are happening in space are from private organizations, SpaceX, for example, and they're spending sending up a lot of satellites and communication things and data relay.
Right. Well, you're right. This is an exciting time, which just means that you're going to have to come back on the show, Larry, and tell us the new books and the new teacher workshops and things that you are leading that are springboarding off of both of these private space missions and the NASA missions. So it has been great talking to you and kind of going back through memory lane. We thank you so much, Larry, for talking to us.
Good. Well, thank you, Dale and Brian, and good luck on your podcast.
Thank you.
Take care. Thanks for listening to our show. If you'd like to know more about this episode or any of our previous episodes, visit laboutloud.com. Lab Out Loud is produced by me, Dale Basler, and my co-host, Brian Bartell. If you have questions, comments, or suggestions for Lab Out Loud, visit laboutloud.com/contacts. Thanks again.